This is the talk that I gave at Hamburg a couple of days ago, and unfortunately the sound completely stuffed up, so I'm trying to record it again. Hope it sounds better this time. And what I was asked to talk about at Hamburg by the student members of the Rethinking Economics group there is what is post-Keynesian economics, because in of course a very revealing statement about the nature of economics education, they said that 98% of the students wouldn't know what the term means, because they've never been exposed to it in their courses, since I was mainly talking to first and second year students. And I have a rather amusing start on this by listening to what Diane Coyle had to say, Diane being one of the authors of the core curriculum, when she was interviewed on the BBC radio program Teaching Economics After the Crash, that I was also interviewed on, that was broadcast on Tuesday of this week. And asked what she thought about the post-crash economic society at Manchester and its demands for change to the curriculum. She said they had this fixation on schools of thought, and they have this idea that there's a monolithic neoclassical school that's dominated economics departments for a long time, and it needs to switch to a different school, or at least introduce lots of different schools of economic thought. And she then comments that that's going backwards. That's going back to the economics of the 1930s. And these almost medieval scholastic debates about what your worldview is. And equally, in talking when I was at Manchester at a debate organised by Post-Crash with Diane Coyle and also George Cooper, one of the student members of the audience asked her a question there about why not teach post-Keynesian economics. And her response was to say that she found it quite bizarre that there's a lot of reaching out for 70 or 100-year-olds historical ways of thinking about the economy when the economy has changed so much. And this to me was, I actually couldn't help but interject at the point to say that last time I checked I thought I was only 60 as a representative of post-Keynesian economics. So is it actually a 70 or 100-year-old way of thinking when the economy is so different? Well, let's take a look back. And were the 1930s so different to today? Well, according to a lot of indicators, of course they were, but the one that I like to focus on is the ratio of private debt to GDP. And I see something of a striking similarity here, because here is the crisis of 1929, here's the crisis of 2007, and this is what happened to the level of private debt, rising at that stage, peaking and then falling after the crisis, and lo and behold, much the same thing here. So maybe there's a bit of a similarity there. And more importantly, what actually happened to the economy in the 1930s that might have inspired people to talk about the economy in the way they're now debating it today? Well, there was what appeared to be a great moderation before the crisis hit, and then bang, unemployment exploded to astronomical levels, 25% being the recorded maximum rate of unemployment in America. And similar, not as severe, but a similar thing happened this time around, of course, because there was this perceived decline in the level of unemployment and a decline in the scale of the cycles as well, which I don't quite show over this time period. It's only starting from 1997 to 2007, and then bang, a blowout in unemployment. Now it's trending down again. So a couple of similarities there as well. And again, focusing on what I regard as the cause of that crisis, which was in both cases, first of all, a debt bubble with far too fast a rate of growth of private debt, and then a slowdown caused by the rate of debt change of debt turning from positive to negative. Here's the 1930s. And I've turned the unemployment rate upside down so you can see the correlation more clearly. But this is on the left-hand side of the scale, I've got the percent of change in private debt each year as a percentage of GDP, ranging from plus 10 to minus 10. And then over here, unemployment ranging from 0 to 25%. And you can see the correlation across that time period is minus 0.78. So an increase in debt, decrease in unemployment. And here's the period of the really severe Great Depression, where for about a 3-year, 4-year period, the private sector was actually reducing its debts, even though the debt ratio rose, because GDP was actually falling faster than they were paying off their debt. Now look at our current time period. And a very similar pattern. A much larger increase in debt as a percentage of GDP, not quite the same level of deleveraging, which is one reason why the crisis, in my opinion, hasn't been as deep, but a rather striking correlation given that neoclassicals like Ben Bernanke claim that pure redistributions, which is what they see private debt as, should have no significant macroeconomic impact. I've got a feeling a correlation of minus 0.93 over a 15-year period is fairly significant. So, and talking of Ben Bernanke, is there a sound explanation for either the 1930s or the modern crisis coming out of mainstream economics? Well, talking about the previous crisis, this is Ben Bernanke saying that there's overwhelming evidence that the main factor depressing aggregate demand was a worldwide contraction of world money supplies, which he blamed on the Federal Reserve, following on the research of Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz. But saying really the crisis is caused by the Fed, and he said it very explicitly when he gave a valedictory, or what would you call it, a Feshreff speech on the 90th, Milton Friedman's 90th birthday, saying, "Let me end my talk by abusing my status as an official representative of the Federal Reserve. I'd like to say to Milton and Anna about the Great Depression, you're right, we did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." Well, whoops. Because if they were the cause last time, maybe Ben Bernanke is responsible for it this time, or Alan Greenspan. And also, the behaviour of mainstream economists after the crisis. Did they dispassionately consider other theories? Did they consider explanations that weren't necessarily their explanations, but maybe had some empirical support behind them? Well, this is Bernanke again before the 2007 crisis hit, writing about Hyman Minsky and Charles Kindleberger, in particular Hyman Minsky. And this is the entire disconsideration of Minsky and Kindleberger in his book. He says, Hyman Minsky and Charles Kindleberger have in several places argued for the inherent instability of the financial system, but in doing so have had to depart from the assumption of rational economic behaviour. Now there is a footnote, and the footnote adds a statement that he doesn't deny the possible importance of irrationality in economic life. However, it seems the best research strategy is to push the rationality postulate as far as it will go. Now, of course, a lot of modern neoclassicals, particularly new Keynesians, are calling themselves Minskians these days, and finally they've heeded the message of Minsky. But that was really as far as it went. They completely ignored an explanation that didn't fit their paradigm, didn't even consider it. And the core curriculum is doing the same thing now after the crisis. And I think it's really time for economics to learn some humility, which is what the post-crash society is really asking for. So is the International Student Initiative for Pluralism in Economics, and the whole Rethinking Economics groups as well. And it reminded me of the statement from Hamlet, where at one stage in a discussion with Horatio says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." And that is certainly the case for economics today. And certainly you shouldn't just ignore what you can't explain, but that is what's going on, and they're ignoring alternative explanations, which is where the call for pluralism from students comes in. So, is it a 70 or 100-year historical way of thinking? And in other words, I think Diane Coyle thought that post-Keynesian meant what Keynes was thinking about when he finished writing the general theory, without realising there's been a 70-year period since then, or 70, 80 years now, of an alternative research paradigm which we call post-Keynesian economics. And that's what it is. It's a different approach to economics inspired by a similar crisis back in the 1930s and a similar failure of the mainstream many, many years ago to either see the crisis coming or to think about alternative approaches to understanding how the economy operates. So I'm only going to be talking very, very superficially about post-Keynesian economics. It's too big a field to cover in a short lecture, and I recommend two references I've got in my references at the end of this set of slides, which I'll post on my blog, by John King. In 2003, his survey, and in 2012, a book of readings written by a number of post-Keynesians, a couple of them by me, giving post-Keynesian positions on different economic issues. And of course, ecological economics is also ignored. Now, there'll be a box in the core program somewhere, but certainly in terms of seeing a need to reorient economics around an ecological approach, that is not what core is doing. It's talking about pasting elements for ecological issues onto the same neoclassical core. Institutional economics, Austrian economics, and Marxist economics. And the ironic thing is that all these schools of thought, the economists in these schools of thought, would have more knowledge of neoclassical economics than neoclassical economists have of them, because we have to read the neoclassical work both to teach it and also because it's the mainstream. They tend not to read us at all, which is why I can get a statement regarding post-Keynesian as meaning what Keynes wrote 80 years ago. So they barely know we exist. Now, what is post-Keynesian? Well, it's partly a critique of neoclassical economics, and this critique dates from well before Keynes himself. Veblen is not the first, but I think probably the most complete in writing a wonderful paper called Why is Economics Not an Evolutionary Science?, talking about the ways in which neoclassical economics, which had been forming over the 30 years or so before he wrote that particular paper, excludes the possibility of evolution in the way that it thinks. And Keynes was just the breaking point, probably the most definitive breaking point, because in 1937 Hicks wrote what people regarded, and people like Paul Krugman still regard, as a summary of Keynes called Mr. Keynes and the Classics, an Interpretation. Oh, sorry, hang on, I've forgotten the actual punchline. Mr. Keynes and the Classics, I think it's a suggested interpretation. In 1937, same year, Keynes wrote his own summary, and the contrast between the two, though Keynes has been called the general theory of employment, couldn't be more vast, and at that point really the two schools completely diverged. And the major focus in the post-Keynesian effort is an emphasis upon realism rather than what neoclassical economists call simplifying assumptions, which I think are better described as fantasies. So, for example, one of the clear fantasies is that you can treat uncertainty about the future as simply risk and apply a probability distribution to it, when of course that's one of the things that Keynes says quite clearly in both the general theory and the general theory of employment, that you simply can't use risk as a proxy for uncertainty. And Koleski's principle of increasing risk is also an interesting application of that idea to the idea of how much investment takes place. And what the neoclassicals have done instead after that have moved so far along the level from trivializing what uncertainty really is to what they call rational expectations, but I think that's better defined as prophetic expectations. If you think of how the neoclassical term is defined, it's effectively saying that there's an agent, the agents in the model know the model itself and therefore can predict the future of the model even when that model includes reality. So if you told an ordinary human being who hadn't done an economics degree that a rational expectations meant having a model which lets you accurately predict the future, and then said, what would you describe that situation as? Oh, they'd say that's the capacity for prophecy. So I'm going to call it prophetic expectations from now on. And one excellent reason to do that is actually provided by one of the leading proponents of this theory, Robert Barrow, who in 1984 wrote a paper talking about the state of rational expectations up until that stage, in which he said that one of the clever things about the rational expectation of revolution was the appropriation of the word rational. In other words, they stole it from the dictionary and gave it a new title, which then meant anybody who let them get away with that slip then had to argue for irrational expectations, which is very hard for anybody to do. Well, let's just steal the word back and define what they call rational as prophetic expectations. And certainly that's not part of post-Keynesian economics. We normally talk about people projecting their current expectations forward and being wrong in a systematic way, which is what we've seen happen throughout history. And that's part of the reason why the economy is cyclical and evolutionary in nature, which again Koleski and Goodwin give us mathematical models of that, and never in equilibrium. And now I'm quoting John Hicks again, because by the time the late 70s had come around, Hicks had thought more and more about what he'd done back in 1937 and realised, largely in conversations with Paul Davidson, who was the editor of the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, realised that he's bastardised the whole concept of expectations to try to force this situation of equilibrium on the economy when the important turning points in the economy, you simply couldn't argue it was an equilibrium. So he wrote a paper in 1981 called ISLM, an Explanation, and I think a better title for that is ISLM, an Apology, and he published it in Paul Davidson's journal, the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, which is one reason why most neoclassicals don't even know the article exists, because they don't read the non-orthodox, the non-neoclassical literature. In many ways, it's a pity that the paper got published there rather than getting it published elsewhere, though of course it may have been rejected from other journals if Hicks had actually tried to submit it, since by the time the 80s came around, the neoclassicals were much more resistant to publishing critical articles than they were back in the 60s and 70s, when people like Joan Robinson were regularly published in the Economic Journal and the American Economic Review and so on. And the main form, again talking about the post-Keynesian positive agenda, and I'm stealing a bit by saying Schumpeter's here. I regard Schumpeter as contributing to that, though he would regard himself as quite different again, more of an evolutionary economist. The main form of competition isn't price, it's evolution. Products evolve. You have competition, meaning that new technologies come along and fight more so than price competition, and we need to include that if we're going to seriously talk about the nature of competition. Money, banks and debt matter in the post-Keynesian framework, starting with Fisher back in 1932. That's actually, I'm referencing his 1933 paper here, but there's another one called Booms, a book called Booms and Depressions, Some First Principles, and in that he argues for the important role that banks play in the economy. If you leave banks out, he's arguing you don't understand capitalism, and Minsky had the same attitude in 1975. Again, anybody who's listening and wants to know where to start with reading Minsky, I'm referencing his 1975 book called John Maynard Keynes. It is not a biography. It is named as a tribute, effectively, to Keynes once he realised how different Keynes was from the textbook version he'd got when he'd done his undergraduate and PhD education back in the 50s. So it's actually the best statement of his hypothesis at a book length. I don't like stabilising an unstable economy. I think it's a very poor book. And my main reference for anybody who wants to get a quick handle on Minsky is to buy his excellent book of readings called Can It Happen Again? And of course, again, these people are arguing you can't model capitalism without money. The final element, there's many more, and John King does a better job of covering all these than I'll do in this very quick talk. But I've also grabbed what I see as the descendants of Piero Sraffa, as part of the post-Keynesian tradition. Again, some economists would disagree with me there. So seeing as production as multi-sectoral, you've got input-output dynamics which are an essential part of a production economy, and you have to include those in a more general model if you're going to do a decent model of capitalism. Again, neoclassicals used to do that, but they couldn't get the equilibrium results they want, so they abandoned that. They had what they call computable general equilibrium back in the 60s and 70s. I think what we need is computable general dynamics. So there's many other strands, and as I said, John King's books are the best way to find out what they are. And just to give an example of the critique side, and there's many critiques, I'm going to focus on the logical and empirical critique of the assumption of rising marginal cost. And this is partially because it's an important issue that neoclassicals have ignored for 80 years, but also because Fred Lee died just recently, and Fred was the post-Keynesian who'd done the most to keep alive this whole empirical tradition of saying that the model of the firm that neoclassicals use is empirically invalid and has been found to be empirically invalid in literally over 100 different surveys over time. Now, the neoclassical theory is the idea that you have rising marginal cost because you can divide inputs into two classes. You can say there are fixed inputs, which are normally machinery in the short run, and a variable input, normally labour, which you can vary, but you've got the amount of labour you apply to a fixed amount of capital. And marginal cost rises in this theory simply because of diminishing marginal productivity. No other reason. The theory assumes wage costs don't change. You've got the same effective quality of workers at the end of increasing your production as you had at the beginning. It's just that you get less productivity out of them because of this diminishing marginal productivity from applying a rising amount of labour to a fixed amount of capital. So I take this stuff very seriously, of course. And I'm going to say, well, let's just imagine we're looking at a company that digs holes in the road with workers and jackhammers, and it starts off with a fixed number of jackhammers, 6 of them. And what does it do according to neoclassical theory? Well, a firm has to hire workers to dig the holes, so it hires one worker, and of course he works all 6 jackhammers at once. And of course, that's sheer bloody nonsense, but that effectively is what the theory is assuming. In fact, what would happen, of course, you one worker per jackhammer, then 2, etc., having idle jackhammers all the way through. But the little lines the theory draws, which shows rising productivity with an increasing amount of labour initially, is because they're arguing that each additional worker, each worker uses all of the fixed capital, and then as you add more workers, you finally approach this ideal ratio of one worker to one jackhammer. So ultimately you get to the stage where you've got 6 workers and 6 jackhammers. And then if you want to increase production beyond that, to dig more holes, you've got to hire more workers because you can't change your fixed capital. So you're going to have 2 workers operating one jackhammer, and then 3, and then 4, etc., who are going to each add a bit more to our output, but not as much as the previous ideal situation. So you get diminishing marginal productivity and therefore rising marginal cost. So, and again, when they draw their marginal cost curves, they have this declining period and then a rising period afterwards. And that's the entire basis of getting a rising marginal cost curve, and then making the assumption of perfect competition, which is something I trash myself in general in debunking economics. The aggregate of firm marginal cost curves is the market supply curve. Again, there's mathematical problems with that, but I'm skipping over them here. Now, the preliminary critique of this was done by Schraffer back in 1926, and there was a whole series of discussions between himself and more conventional economists who still couldn't quite understand what he was talking about, unfortunately. And he pointed out that the assumption of diminishing marginal productivity has one input to production that's fixed and another that's variable, which gives you the rising supply curve. But he said to actually get supply and demand analysis working, the supply curve you derive has to be independent of the demand curve. And he said that therefore puts conditions on when you can have the concept of a fixed factor. Because he said if you defined a factor broadly, such as land, capital and labour, then you certainly have got a fixed supply of land, for example. So if you're going to use that factor more, if you want to increase output, then you have to increase the amount of labour you apply to land, and you're going to therefore drive up potentially the price of both labour and land, which will change the distribution of income. So if you define the factor broadly and you say you want to have a more intense usage of that, so you're competing to buy available land or to rent available land, you're going to drive up the rent of land. That therefore changes the distribution of income, which will then affect the demand curve. So you can't have independent supply and demand curves when you work at the level of aggregation, a very high level where you have capital, labour, land are your inputs, agriculture, mining, services are your outputs. On the other hand, if you define both the factor and the industry narrowly, so let's say your factor is stapling guns and your industry is cardboard boxes, or as I had an example earlier, if your industry is digging holes in the road and your factor is jackhammers, then you can acquire extra jackhammers from elsewhere, or you can have ones that are lying around idle right now. I've got staples in this particular example, and by changing the demand for staplers, you don't really change the price in other industries all that much. So you get that independence of supply and demand. But then when you get that, you don't have a fixed factor anymore, because you can hire more stapling guns, so you can hire more jackhammers, and you therefore maintain an ideal ratio between your labour and your so-called fixed factor. So you don't get diminishing marginal productivity, and you therefore get a linear output function from your input. You add an extra worker, you get you've now got 10 workers or 11 workers where you had 10, you're going to have 10% more output. So the marginal product is constant, so your cost is going to be constant. So Schraffer was saying you have two possibilities. Either you define it broadly, so in which case you can talk about having a fixed factor and having to use it more intensively, but you do that, you're going to get a different demand curve for every point you draw on a supply curve. So you can't have this independent supply and demand analysis. Or, if you divide it narrowly, which is the right way to go about it, then you're going to get a constant ratio of capital to labour right out to capacity, and therefore your output's going to rise very smoothly right out to capacity. And that's going to give you, therefore, constant marginal cost, and that'll give you a falling average cost, which makes it very hard to, if you had set price equal to marginal cost, which is the neoclassical theory, you can't even do it. Now, that's the logical critique, but the logic could have, again, as Hamlet said to Horatio, there can be more things in heaven and earth than in your philosophy. Maybe the logic was wrong. But empirical work dating right back to the 1930s confirms that when you ask businessmen what their cost structure is like, they find that there's constant or falling marginal cost. And this was even discovered by leading neoclassical Alan Blinder in a book called Asking About Prices, written back in 1998. And he found that it did a survey which actually involved 15% of America's corporations in terms of their contribution to GDP being surveyed. So we're talking not just trivial surveys, we're talking not just critics of neoclassical economics, we're talking even neoclassicals when they bother to ask firms what their cost structures are like. They find between 89%, which was Blinder's finding, and 95%, which is pretty much the average of all the other studies, find that firms have got, first of all, they don't even know what you're talking about when you talk about marginal revenue, marginal cost. They're foreign concepts, and every extra sale adds to profit. They also find this idea of declining marginal cost. Well, one little point that I hope this, being a bit satirical here, points out the issue. If the neoclassical theory is correct, then there'd have to be somebody whose job it was to tell sales staff when to stop selling, otherwise you'd be selling past the point where you profit maximised. Now that would mean there'd be a sales manager ringing up the staff and saying, stop selling, we've reached the point where marginal revenue cost equals marginal revenue, or we're not making a profit anymore, stop selling. When did a sales manager ever make that call? Never. And nobody ever will, because all firms find that extra sales add to profit, that average cost falls with output, and in fact they do better. The higher the level of output they do, the lower their costs are, and they set a markup on average costs, and the more they sell past the target point, the higher the profit is, because their costs are actually falling as they get to that level. And they don't ever reach capacity. A firm that got to capacity would be either growing extremely rapidly or not doing its investment plans properly. So one of the best surveys was done back in 1952 by Eitman and Guthrie, and they showed managers from a number of, I think about 350 corporations they sent surveys out to. They showed them 8 hypothetical average cost curves. And if you take a look at them, 1 and 2 are nothing like anybody's idea of cost curves, but 3 pretty much looks like what you'd see in Mancue. Period of falling cost, and then sharply rising cost from less than the 50% mark. 4 and 5, slightly more extreme away from the neoclassical vision, but those are the only ones that fit the neoclassical idea. And 5, they described high minimum output, declining to a least cost point near capacity, after which they rise sharply. Now, in fact, if you look at Mancue, 3 is really the most neoclassical. 5 is stretching it, because they normally show a small period where average costs fall, and then a long part where they rise, and that part from here up is the so-called supply curve. Now 6 and 7 in particular, don't look anything like the neoclassical idea, because here you have declining costs for a hell of a long way, then a tiny bit of increase. Here you have declining all the way out and then flat, and 8 you have declining from a lower level. Now, what do they get back as survey results? Now, even being generous and saying that 5 is neoclassical when really 3 is the most obvious neoclassical one, only 18 of the 336 responses they got, 334, fitted the neoclassical vision. That was it. 2/3 of them gave the answer that they had the lowest unit cost at maximum output, and then another substantial, almost another third, said that they had a slight increase at that level when they got right to capacity. So we have a theory of the firm which fits 5% of companies if you're lucky, when 95% of them have constant or falling marginal costs. So you can't even get to the beginning point of saying marginal revenue equals marginal cost, because you have to have rising marginal cost for this to be any guide for profit maximisation. Otherwise your average costs are going to be above your marginal costs, and we find this huge contradiction of neoclassical theory. So why did diminishing marginal productivity not apply? Well, engineers design factories, and this is quoting from Eitman, I think, so as to cause the variable factor, i.e. labour, to be used most efficiently when the plant is operated close to capacity. He said, under such conditions, an average variable cost declines until its capacity output, and a marginal cost curve derived from that average cost curve lies below the average cost curve, which makes it physically impossible for the firm to determine its scale of operations by equating marginal cost and marginal revenues. And even more amusingly, when the business people who, then back in those days, thank God, didn't do economics degrees, when they had their theory explained to them, they were actually offended to have economists apparently believing that they behave this way, because they saw this as having a vision of business being primitive. And this is a wonderful quote from one of the survey participants saying, the amazing thing is that any sane economist sane economist. I'm beginning to wonder about that phrase. Any sane economist could consider number 3, number 4, and number 5 as representing business thinking. And here he's actually thinking that economists are trying to criticise business, assuming a premise that business is not progressive. He said, even with low efficiency and overtime pay, our unit cost would still decline with increased production, since the absorption of fixed expenses would be more than offset the direct expenses occurred. So this is people running factories saying our costs decline right out to output. Now there's many more critiques than this. This is just one that indicates how what the neoclassics call simplifying assumptions actually are either fantasies or frequently contradict reality. And post-Keynesians insist upon realism rather than fantasy, even though it makes it harder to do the modelling. In many ways, the neoclassical school fits that wonderful idea of the drunk looking under a lamppost trying to find his keys, because that's where the light is, not where he lost the keys. So there's many alternative strands, and I mentioned a few of these beforehand. One is Schraffian economics, which is not particularly active these days, but derived from Schraffer's work, which has a focus upon input-output dynamics. Keynesian economics, which has a focus on cyclical growth. The stock flow consistent approach, which is fairly dominant these days, where strict accounting for monetary stocks and flows is done, and Wynne Godley pioneered that, and Mark Lavoie is carrying on that work. Modern monetary theory, which talks about the capacity for fiat money creation to overcome recessions. Minskian economics, which is giving a monetary explanation for dynamic instability and crises, and that's very much the area that I work in. And I'm trying to blend those together as best I can, but I'm certainly not the only person working in the field, and nor am I the only approach to be taken, and there's a huge amount of work needed to bring this area together. But you'll find realism being a focus throughout, so looking at some elements which are coming into the work that I'm doing now, inspired by Bob Ayres' work on energy and entropy, focusing on evolutionary dynamics, which I think is very important from Schumpeter. The main thing I'm doing now, and when I'm talking about my contribution, is incorporating banks, debt and money into macroeconomics. Now the neoclassical mainstream ignores this, and of course I had that wonderful debate with Paul Krugman, if you call it a debate, where the fact that mainstream economists ignore banks, debt and money was made obvious by the way he commented upon my paper for the Berlin INET conference, and he said that Keene asserts that putting banks in the story is essential. And this is one of these drop-dead lines. Now I'm all for including the banking sector in stories where it's relevant, but why is it so crucial to a story about debt and leverage? Only a mainstream economist could write that. He said, I say it's because once you include banks, lending increases the money supply. Now he starts getting into a bit of verbal trashing. Why does that matter? He said he seems to assume, which I don't, that aggregate demand can't increase unless the money supply rises. And of course I don't have a fixed velocity. That's one reason I included it in the models I'll be bringing up shortly. So I've become strict monetarist. No, we haven't, but anyway. And then he says lending can and does increase aggregate demand, so what's the problem? Well, let's find out, because curiously enough, even though the paper that he wrote with Egerton didn't include a bank, in the online appendix there is a bank, as they describe it. It's a rather bizarre idea of a bank, but I can use that as a structure to say, well, let's just take banks, leave our banks outside the model, and then include them by making them provide loans and see what happens. So the model has lending between patient and impatient agents, where the bank is an intermediary. So the bank facilitates a loan and charges the fees of the lender to make a profit out of doing it, but otherwise doesn't take part in lending at all. So I replicate this in Minsky, and I leave out some of the standard new Keynesian fantasy elements, for example, of having hybrid worker capitalists, which therefore means that they ignore wage and profit distribution. And of course I'm not using prophetic expectations. So instead what I have is both patient and impatient are capitalists. Patient produces the consumption good, which is what they've got in their appendix model. Impatient borrows and produces the investment good, again as in their model. And they both hire workers, produce output, sell to each other, to the workers and to the banker. And I see what happens. Now when I model it, what I start from, I'm jumping over a bit here, pardon me. Okay. What they argue is that banks, by intermediating, lending itself doesn't change demand. And this is, again, an excellent statement of the position by Krugman. He says, Keene then goes on to assert that lending is, by definition, an addition to aggregate demand. He says he doesn't get that at all. And excellent statement of what the neoclassical vision of banks, the role of banks is. If I decide to cut back on my spending and stash the funds in a bank, which lends them out to someone else, this doesn't have to represent a net increase in demand. He then says, yes, okay, you can get it out of people with a higher propensity to spend. He said, but Keen's saying something else, and he's not sure what. He said, I think it has something to do with the notion that creating money equals creating demand. But he said, but again, that isn't right in any model I understand. And everything on that page is correct. Well, let's model it. Oh dear, I'm repeating myself. I should have knocked this slide out. I had the chance. I forgot about that. Pardon me, repetition. Okay, next bit. Okay, so modeling it, what I do is with Minsky, what the Minsky software lets you do is to model the economy using double entry bookkeeping as well as modeling the physical flows. So what I have here is patient and impatient being two agents. Patient having $80 in the bank, or $80 million, impatient having 18, the bank having an equity of 2, and that sums to a total reserves in the banking system of 100. So every row and every row sums to 0, which is using the accounting standards, double entry bookkeeping, to make sure you've got your logic properly set out. So every row has to sum to 0. That means that assets are shown as positive, and liabilities and equity are shown as negative, and the sum sums to 0. I'm using the accounting standards of credit and debit here, but I find that actually a bit on the confusing side. As it happens, I prefer to use plus and minus, which I'll use in the model later. So let's take a look and see what happens when I put the entire model together. As I said, I'm going to put this up on I'll put the PowerPoint files up on my blog as well. So if you get the PowerPoint, click there. That'll let you download the latest version. Let's see if that actually works. Tick, tick, tick. Here we go. And that takes you to the beta builds. Russell Standish, who's the programmer, has just released a couple of very useful new versions of the program that overcome a number of bugs and add a couple of very useful features. I'll put a slide together about that shortly. So here's the full model. I'll change the initial numbers a bit. So I have reserves, which are where the bank puts the money that's been deposited with it by the various agents. The investment agent's deposit account, the consuming agent's deposit account, the worker's deposit account, and bank equity. And you'll notice the total here sums to 0. And what I have with lending, because you're showing the liability, the accounts as liabilities, adding a positive sum to a liability actually reduces it, adding a negative increases it. So that is actually the operation of lending goes from the consumer agent across to the investing agent in that fashion. And the same thing applies in all the other rows there. Now notice there's no sign of debt. That's because this is looking at the economy from the point of view of the bank, and in the neoclassical model, the debt is not an asset of the bank, it's an asset of the consumer sector. So you've got to have a consumer sector table, and that's what this looks like, and that replicates a few of the features of the other, because here's lending and here's repayment, but there's the debt. Now notice also the consumer's deposit account here is shown as a positive sum, because we're now looking at the consumer account from the consumer's point of view. Of course, it's an asset, so it's got a positive value, and equally so does the debt. So what lending does is reduce the amount of money that's in the deposit account, but match that with an increasing an asset, which is the debt obligation that the investing agent now owes to the consuming agent. And of course, the consuming agent is doing without that cash in the meantime, which means their capacity to spend has been reduced by making the loan. So when I simulate it, and I'll bring up Minsky and show that now. Notice, watch velocity down here, by the way, just to show that it's not constant. So I'm simulating it now, and what I've got here are what are called time constants. That is an engineering idea of how the time constant tells you roughly how long something takes to double. It's actually about a 2/3 increase in a value. But if you have something growing at a rate of, if the time constant is 7, then it roughly doubles over a 7-year period. Or if you're reducing something and it's say over 9, then it roughly halves over a 9-year period. So what I've got here is lending roughly doubling every 7 years, repayment cutting debt in half for every 9 years. And we simulate this, and what we get first of all is virtually no growth. Growth is absolutely flatlining. We're out, by the way, so far to about 100 years worth of simulation here. I'll slow it down a bit. Now if I increase the rate of lending by going to a smaller number, we get tiny blips in the growth rate. Notice also changes in velocity down here and changes in GDP over here, and a rising debt ratio now because there's more lending going on. And if I then also have the repayment taking much longer, so rather than trying to halve the debt every 9 years, they try to halve it every 30 years, then we have a dramatic increase in the debt ratio, which you see down here. The debt ratio is rising away. Debt now far exceeds the amount of money in the system. Tiny change to GDP, tiny changes to velocity, and little blips on the growth rate. And if we then have a dramatic increase in the rate at which debts are repaid, bit of a blip in growth there, and a dramatic slowdown in lending, then the debt ratio plunges, but not much has happened to GDP. And I'll go back to the original situation again. Let's go back to 7 years for doubling the loan and 9 years for repaying. So you've had dramatic changes in the debt ratio, but pretty trivial changes in GDP. And they're all due just to changes in velocity, which are happening down here. So from that point of view, Krugman's quite right. If loanable funds describes the institution of banking, then banking is fairly irrelevant, and as Bernanke says, pure redistribution should have no significant macroeconomic effect. But what if we make this fantasy assumption that banks actually lend money? What if we bring the real world in here? And I'm going to modify that model to take out the argument that the loan is an asset of the consumer sector and say, hey, maybe it's an asset of the bank, and then see what happens. So let's just give that a try in Minsky. And what I can do here, I can bring up the table for the consumer sector here, and I can delete that particular column and also delete this lending, debt repayment, interest payments, and bank fee operations. And I've now got to change the net worth of the consumer sector to say it's 60 rather than 70 because they don't actually own that loan. And then come across to the banking sector and say, well, let's add another asset here. And then with the drop-down menu, since the model still has the debt of the investment sector shown as a liability of the investing sector, then it's sitting in the system as a liability, which means it can be an asset for somebody else. So I click here and choose D as the debt, and now it brings across the operations from that particular account. And now I just have to say, well, in fact, because this is an additional asset, the net equity position of the bank is actually 15. Get rid of the bank fee because we're not considering intermediation. I could leave it in there, but I might as well get rid of it for this model, and then show that the interest payments are made to the bank rather than the consumer sector. And then finally, in the model, what I had was lending being based on the amount of money in the consumer agent's deposit account. Let's just get rid of that and make it instead based on the amount of debt. So I've got the rate of growth of debt being a function of the level of debt at the moment. Let's drag it out there. Okay, stop the system. It'll run more slowly now because there's just a bug in Minsky. Once I make a change like this, the program simulation speed slows down. Start at the same point. What you'll see fairly rapidly is the growth rate is positive. The economy is growing. And so is the amount of money. You can now see that the red line here, which is the level of money, is rising. And if I accelerate the level of lending, then GDP growth increases, as does the amount of money. If I slow down the rate of repayment, growth increases even more. We're out to about 14 years worth out here, by the way. And notice GDP has risen quite substantially. Now if we then have a sudden decision to repay debt more rapidly, then your GDP growth rate declines, and if lending also slows down, it can go negative. And I'll go back up to the original stage again, where I had 7 years and 9 years. And notice we've had a boom in GDP and a slump, coinciding with a boom and a slump in debt levels, and now growth is back to its previous trend level again. So we've now got growth occurring again, but we've had a boom in the economy and a slump caused by a change in the level of lending by banks. That's why banks, debt and money matter. And that's how simple it is to show the difference between the loanable funds fantasy of what banks actually do, and of course what the Bank of England has told us, the real world, where banks are the ones who lend, and a change in the rate of lending affects the level of economic activity. So, there's the overall simulation. So, that's just a vision of the importance of including banks' debt and money in the economy. That's why it matters. Now, what I've been doing throughout my academic career is attempting to build models of a cyclical economy and then add to that the existence of money and the role of money and debt in the economy, and then totally get to the stage where we can do a totally integrated monetary and real modelling of the economy. And what I've built that on is the work of Richard Goodwin back in 1967, who built a simple model of cyclical growth. And I've now, the first thing I did back in my PhD was to add money and debt into that, but money in an implicit sense. Now what I've done since then is build the capacity with a software package like Minsky to actually explicitly include money and banking. But Goodwin's model was a very simple cyclical growth model. It had start from the argument that the amount of capital stock you have, roughly speaking, determines output. An output, therefore, determines the level of employment you need. Your planned level of output determines how many workers that have to be hired. The employment rate determines the rate of change of wages, so Phillips curve. In this very simple two-class model, since you've already worked out output up here, wages deducted from output determines profits. Profits determine investment, investment's the rate of change of capital, and you're back where you started again. So you've got a cyclical model coming out of that. So the simplest possible relationship is to say there's a fixed ratio between capital and output. Again, it doesn't have to be fixed. You can make it more realistic, making it variable. Output is when you divide by labour productivity gives you the level of employment. Level of employment divided by population gives the employment rate. You then feed that into a Phillips curve here, and I'm using a simple linear Phillips curve here, not because I believe the relationship is linear, just because it shows that the cycles I'll show you come out of the structure of the model rather than out of any assumed non-linearities. Then what you have is a Phillips curve relationship, so the rate of change of wages is the current level of wages multiplied by this function. Wages times labour, the wage rate times the amount of labour determines the wage bill, and that's your basic non-linearity. You're multiplying one variable, because wages are a variable in the system, by another, which is the level of employment, and that's what's causing the cycles. Then output minus wages is profit. All profit is invested in the simple Goodwin model. Gross investment minus depreciation is the rate of change of capital stock, so you go back and determine capital again, and you've closed this cycle here. Now, I built that in Minsky using very simple parameter values. So I've got a capital output ratio of 3, a labour to output ratio of 1, a reaction coefficient on the Phillips curve of 10, so the slope is 10. So if unemployment's 1% below the level that workers accept no change in wages at, there will be a 10% rise in wages. And I've got the equilibrium in terms of workers' wage reaction to unemployment of 90%. So a 10% unemployment rate means no change in real wages, and they've got a 10% rate of depreciation as well, and 120 workers in the system to begin with. So I start off with a level of unemployment, given that I've got 300 units of capital, which means 100 units of out can be reduced, and you're going to have 20% of the workforce roughly out of a job. So let's run that in Minsky, and what you get is a cyclical system. Now again, it's amazing how neoclassicals struggle to understand how you can have a cyclical model when it's so easy to put one together. But if I just zoom up a bit here and let's redraw that and then move it over a bit sideways, okay, and simulate this model. I'll slow it down because it simulates rather rapidly. What you get is cycles in wages share of output and the employment rate, which go on indefinitely. That was Goodwin's basic model. Now I've got a bit of realism, and that is to say that capitalists don't invest all their profits. They invest more than their profits during a boom and less than their profits during a slump. And using a linear investment function to take account of that, I now have to have a rate of profit being output minus wages divided by the capital stock, and then an investment function depending on how much this actual rate differs from the rate that makes capitalists just happy to invest exactly what they earn in profits. And I'm ignoring, of course, where they get the funds to invest when they want to invest more than their profit, and also where they store the surplus when they want to invest less than profit. But I'll bring that in a moment. So with the simple parameter values, the 3% rate of profit that makes capitalists happy to invest 3%, a fraction function of 10, so if the rate of profit is 0.04, they invest substantially more. Whack it in there and you get exactly the same cycles. Let's look at that. This is now the same model but with an investment function down here, rather than simply saying profits are investment, you now get a rate of profit being determined minus an equilibrium level multiplied by a reaction function. It gives you the investment as a proportion of output, multiply that by output, that becomes the actual gross level of investment, subtract depreciation, you get the rate of change of capital stock. Simulate that model and you get the same sort of cyclical behaviour. It doesn't change the actual nature of the model, and that's because of a little element of what's called reality, which is the mathematical logic as well. A two-dimensional system can't give you chaotic behaviour. But I bring in the realism now and saying, the second bit of realism, capitalists borrow money when their desired investment exceeds their profits, and banks charge interest on the outstanding level of debt. So that adds two more equations to the model. I've now got the rate of profit being net, not just of wages, but also interest on existing debt, and I have the rate of change of debt being investment minus net profits. And using a 5% rate of interest, when I simulate this model, I get something very different indeed. And I'm waiting for my, here we go, there it is, model to come up. Now let's just make it a bit larger and drag it over a bit. I should make it a bit smaller. And slow it down a bit too, and simulate it. And what you see initially are diminishing cycles in employment and a declining level of wages share, but then ultimately all hell breaks loose, a very linear hell because I've got linear functions everywhere, but a rising level of debt to GDP and wilder cycles until finally a breakdown occurs. So what's going on there? Well, now that we have a three-dimensional system, you have the possibility for chaotic behaviour, even with a model with linear behavioural assumptions inside it. And we notice what happens. The qualitative nature of this model is quite remarkable, because there's a period where there appears to be declining volatility, the Great Moderation, which we saw happen not just in the 1990s and 2000s, early 2000s, but also back in the 1920s. Then there's rising volatility and breakdown, ultimately. There's a rising level of debt to GDP, and there's increasing inequality because workers are getting a smaller and smaller amount of output, even though they're not doing any borrowing of money here. In effect, they pay for the higher level of debt with a lower level of wages. Now, that's all about nonlinear functions. The reason you bring in nonlinear functions in a model is to be more realistic about people's behaviour. So when I add that inside there, I get a different sort of cycles, which I've jumped over here for the sake of time. But what I'm now also looking at, what about if you have a government that resolutely defends a particular level of unemployment by paying a subsidy to banks, to firms rather, which is a response to the rate of unemployment. So I now have the rate of change of government spending divided by GDP as a function of the employment rate, and I now have this subsidy turning up by the government payment to firms as part of what net profits are, and then bring in more realistic functions again now, where I've got rather than a constant straight line wage reaction function or investment function or government function, I've got exponential function, which I'll spell out there in a bit of detail. Now that particular model, when you put it together, and I'm emphasising I've got resolute behaviour by the government and workers also having the same level of unemployment they respond to over time. Of course, both those things have happened. The governments have accepted a high level of unemployment over time, and so have workers in terms of the level at which they will demand wage rises. But when I simulate this model, I get extremely complex cycles. And this is the nature of modelling the economy with endogenous rather than imposed exogenous shock volatility. If I simulate this model, you might initially think it's heading towards equilibrium, as you watch the employment rate versus wages share. And notice you've got a rising public debt ratio and a rising level of private debt as well. Let's speed it up a bit here. Looks like it's reached equilibrium over here, but watch carefully. And this is replicating something which Minsky spoke about verbally, which is that economic stability doesn't mean the absence of cycles. It means the absence of a breakdown. And this is the model where government spending or government subsidies, by counteracting the tendency to euphoric expectations and euphoric investments during a boom, and then providing a cash flow when firms are in a crisis during a downturn, means that you have cycles but you don't have a total breakdown where the debt simply overwhelms the economy, which is what happens when you have the private sector model. And this is simply adding a government sector to that model, which was the one which had a breakdown earlier when I had a non-linear. I might risk things here and just see if I actually, let's see if I can actually get rid of that from profit. So I just delete that particular line. Let's see what happens. It's good to be a stuff up, but it's always worth a try. Let's speed it up a bit in simulation terms. You get a complete collapse in employment. So you get realism out of the post-Keynesian approach. This is one, a set of many attempts to bring that realism in there. So there's much, much more to post-Keynesian work than I've shown here, and it's again John King's survey back in 2012 is an excellent overview of all the various approaches post-Keynesians take to various issues in economics. And there's many other schools of thought as well: the Austrian, evolutionary, ecological, feminist, Marxist, institutional econophysics. It sounds like a grab bag, but given the failure of the neoclassical paradigm, that's what we should be teaching, because without teaching all the current approaches, we won't be able to evolve a realistic paradigm over time. We need to think of all the various contributions that have been made. Austrians make contributions, even though I disagree with their theory of value. Austrians make contributions that post-Keynesians don't. Evolutionary theory does things that post-Keynesians don't do. Ecological is a major hole in what the post-Keynesian school provides, and ditto for the other elements as well, including what physicists are doing these days. We need to teach all this and to have economists aware of it and students aware of it, so we can ultimately evolve a decent replacement for neoclassical economics, which I see as a failed paradigm, in the same sense that Ptolemy's theory of astronomy was a failed paradigm which had to be replaced ultimately. And that's why I support what the students are doing, both in Hamburg, where I gave this talk, and around the world in my own university as well, where they're keeping me on my toes about pluralism. And there are a handful of universities, which Kingston is one, where we do teach alternative approaches. So put pressure on your own staff to provide an alternative. Don't fall for core. And if you don't get what you want, then you can always come and join me in Kingston.